All right, hello. My name is Antonio Santa Cruz, and on behalf of my group, I will be doing the voiceover for our project. Um, so as you can see from our front page here, this is a final project case study over the character Rorschach from Watchmen. So let's begin. So the character we chose today was Rorschach from Watchmen. If you are not familiar with Watchmen, it is a very interesting graphic novel written by Alan Moore in 1986. This graphic novel has 12 different chapters, each kind of describing this array of plots through different vigilante work, and we're going to specifically look at Rorschach. Now, this book was later adapted into theaters under the directing vision of Zack Snyder, but for this project, we mostly looked at the comic book as it has more information towards Rorschach's background. So let's go ahead and start looking at Rorschach. Now, background information. Although I will be referring to him as Rorschach, his true identity is Walter Kovacs. This will be his citizen name, where Rorschach is how the media and everybody else knows him. Alright, so here's some background on Walter Kovacs. In early childhood, Kovac was born into an abusive mother, and he had no father. At age 11, a violent fight would lead Kovac to being taken from his mother's care and put to a home for problem children. When he was 16 years old, Kovac would later leave home in order to become a garment worker. And at this garment shop, this is where he would basically find this kind of interesting material to later make his mask. And then in 1964, after reading the murder of Kinney Genovese, in which 38 witnesses did nothing to help the young woman who was being murdered, Kovac donned a mask and then became a vigilante. So I actually think this is really an interesting point because Kinney Genovese is actually a real person. Often we learn about her in our psychology classes, and I just think it was interesting that Alan Moore chose a real person to kind of make Rorschach snap into his vigilante work. Now, that was his childhood. We will later now talk about his adulthood. So in 1975, while investigating the disappearance of a young girl by the name of Blair Roche, he basically found out that this girl was brutally murdered. And this realization of the murder kind of makes Walter snap and take on his new persona, which he later identifies himself now as Rorschach. And after basically finding this out, he kills the murderer's dogs and then burns the murderer in his house. So now we can kind of see that he's taking on this vigilante work as a brutal killer trying to root out the evil within the city. Later in 1985, while he's investigating another death, the death of Edward Blake, he basically succumbs to a police operation where he's later unmasked and arrested. So during his imprisonment, he was analyzed by a psychoanalyst to better understand his past. And we will focus a lot on this interview with the psychoanalyst as we will better learn more information about his history and past. Later, when a prison riot breaks out, Rorschach basically breaks out of prison with the help of other vigilantes, and afterwards he finds out who the actual murderer was for Edward Blake, and Rorschach and some other vigilantes go and confront the perpetrator, and this perpetrator's name is Vidette. And it was really interesting that within this kind of plan of things, Vidette is actually another superhero, and the reason he killed Edward Blake was because he had this grand scheme, and this scheme was basically to unite the world together against a fake alien threat in order to avoid a nuclear holocaust. Now, this might sound kind of crazy, but within the book, it's actually a very well thought out plan, I guess you could say, and as a result, Vidette's plan actually worked. And so, because this period was set into the when the Soviet Union and the U.S. were kind of fighting in the Cold War, basically because of this plan, they stopped the Cold War and entered a peace period. And so in the end, Vidette's plan actually did end up working. And so all the other vigilantes, after finding out the secret of Vidette's plan, kind of make a vow not to tell anyone the motives behind Vidette's plan, because then it would basically put the U.S. and Soviet Union back into a Cold War. Now, except for Rorschach. Rorschach believed that the truth was always key, was always the answer. And so he basically told the other vigilantes that he was going to tell them regardless, and because of this, one of the other vigilantes would kill him because they wanted to keep the secret a truth. Or the truth is secret. Alright, so now, let's look at symptoms. So, After looking at Rorschach throughout the comic book, we've kind of arrived at these main symptoms. The most prominent symptom given by Kovac is his self-identification. So basically, he kind of alternates between two personas, which is Walter Kovacs, which is his true identity, his real name, and Rorschach. He often considers his masked persona his true identity. So whenever he refers to himself, he refers to himself as Rorschach, even going so far as to say that when he's in his normal, just dressed like a normal person, a human being, he will identify Walter Kovac as his basically mask to his identity. So he actually believes that Walter Kovac is not actually his true self, but rather just like a cover for his true identity, which he now believes is Rorschach. Another symptom given off by Kovac is that he seems to be psychologically weakest or triggered when females are the source of distress. So we first realize this when he murders witnesses that no one helped the murder of Kitty Genovese, and then finally after finding out Blair Roche. And without the book, he also does a lot of vigilante work, and most of it is probably due to young women or even just older women being the victims of many crimes. And so he often goes in, we can even think of this as maybe as like a trigger of some sort. This is what causes him to become Rorschach and then do the work that he does. Now, other symptoms that we've been, or that's very prominent in Walter Kovacs is basically that he is a very violent individual. Throughout the comic, there are multiple times when he engages in very violent acts. And just for example, I'll just give you just three examples here. In one scene when he's trying to find out information about a criminal he's tracking, he enters a bar and he starts breaking the fingers of all the men in the bar until someone starts telling him information. This one's kind of funny. When an eager fan of Rorschach kind of tries to fake jump him in order to get a reaction from him, Rorschach does not take this very well and ends up throwing the young man down an elevator shaft. And then when he's in prison, after he was set up in the police sting, one of the inmates tries to jump him, basically tell him, hey, I'm gonna kill you. He reaches behind the lunch counter and pulls out a boiling hot oil kind of crate and then just throws at this inmate's face. So we can see that this individual is very violent, or often relies to violence to solve his problems. So with all this in mind, we have to give him a diagnosis. After consulting the DSM-5, we kind of collaborated and basically came to the conclusion that Walter Kovacs most likely probably has dissociative identity disorder. Now, before claiming this, we want to first go through all the diagnostic criteria and make sure that he meets all these. So after reading through, we found out that he actually meets 4 out of the 5 diagnostic criteria. So he actually meets A, C, and D symptoms. So the first one is A, which is basically just showing 2 distinct personalities. Basically, this is just stating that the individual has 2 distinct personalities that they kind of differ from each other. Rorschach is a very violent vigilante trying to root out the evils throughout the world, and Walter Kovacs is just a normal human being. Throughout the comic book, he's actually dressed up as I don't know if his job was a bum, or he has no job, but basically he just walks around the street with a kind of a sign just saying the end is near. And so that is his normal personality, just acting as a normal human being, even if it is just being a bum. And then his different personality, which is Rorschach, a vigilante. So C, which is the next one, is Walter often has trouble kind of following social norms when communicating with others. So it's actually kind of funny. Throughout the entire book, anytime he gets information about a lead and he wants to tell his other vigilante friends, instead of just meeting in a public area like the others do, he'll actually break into the other vigilantes' houses just in order to talk to them. And there's a really funny scene where he breaks into one of his friends' houses in order to tell him information. And he kind of catches, the other vigilante catches Rorschach in his kitchen, and he's sitting there eating beans out of a can, and he kind of goes, hey man, you want to just go grab a bite and we can talk about it? And he goes, nah, beans in a can is all I need. So he kind of has trouble kind of understanding boundaries and also what is normal, how to act as a normal human being. Now, another symptom was the D part of the diagnostic criteria, which is basically just understanding that the symptoms being displayed by Walter do not stem from any cultural or religious practices. Throughout the book, there is no indication that there was some kind of religion or cultural reason behind the things he did. In fact, it was very much obviously stated that the murder is what kind of triggered him to maybe split personalities. That is, of course, with the help of the trauma that he had already experienced. So we do not really see that there's any cultural or religious practice that caused this kind of split in personality. And finally, we look at basically just understanding that Walter's symptoms did not come from taking intoxicants, blackouts, or any other medical condition. Throughout the book, it doesn't state that he takes any kind of alcohol, drugs, or anything like that. And he doesn't have any medical conditions as far as we know, and he never is seen blacking out. So to further look at the diagnosis, we kind of want to look at the risk and prognostic factors. Walter was abused as a child by his mother. Now, his mother was actually a prostitute, and so it wouldn't really be that he was interfering with his business, but mostly just trying to, relate to his mother, but he never actually got a good mother role, and so she would often abuse him just because he would interfere with the business. And because of his mother's occupation, other children that he went to school with knew about what his mother did and would often bully him and further adding to his torment. And so basically there's one point in the scene too where he just gets so fed up he jumps the two bullies and ends up biting the cheek off of one of them. So this is just setting up Walter Kovac to basically split personalities. And finally, suicide risk. We want to look at Walter to make sure, is this individual putting himself in situations that could get him harmed, or, is he willing to commit suicide? And it is very obvious that the Rorschach personality very much likes to get himself in risky situations. So we'll actually see that in multiple scenes throughout the book, he will just confront criminals very violently, and even the police. So the most clear example of this is, as you can see below, I inserted a small comic of what was actually happening. But the police basically came in, or this is when he was in a police setup, and throughout this police setup, he was given the option to basically come out peacefully, and rather than coming out peacefully, not dying, he kind of realizes that he needs to escape. So he actually reaches down behind like a cabinet and finds an aerosol can and a lighter, and he starts lighting the police on fire in order to escape. And once he kind of makes his escape, he jumps out through the window, and then he finds out that the building is surrounded. And so it's still, instead of giving up, he actually starts getting in a fist fight, hand-to-hand combat with all the other police until they finally overpower him. So as you can see, he often puts himself in very risky situations that could end up killing himself, and he doesn't really seem to understand, at least the Rorschach personality doesn't understand the dangers that he's putting himself into. And so lastly, we have to kind of understand whether or not Rorschach or Walter Kovacs is faking this, because dissociative identity disorder is a very controversial disorder. In fact, many people, other psychologists, don't really believe it to be true. So we kind of have to take this into account as to whether or not Walter Kovacs is basically making this up. And so in order to do this, we have to kind of look at the situation that he is in. So the first thing we have to understand is that when we are analyzing him, and this is the information from the book, he was actually arrested after that police operation. And so one might say, Rorschach or Walter Kovacs is basically faking all these things to get out of trouble. But as we kind of look at this, we kind of realize this is not really true, or at least one of the statements that's kind of backs this is the fact that he has a very different personality when he's talking to him as basically Rorschach. So he still believes he's Rorschach, he just doesn't have his mask on. And he often snaps at the psychoanalyst who is interviewing him, saying, "Oh, you need to identify me as Rorschach, I am not Walter Kovacs." And so we can kind of see that there is a distinction in the personality that he believes he is, and the way he acts with the psychoanalyst. Now, you could still say maybe he's just a really good actor. There's no proof of this. I think one of the best reasons is my final point here is just simply the fact that he does not really care whether or not he goes to jail, and he also doesn't really care if he gets the death penalty or anything like that. As long as he's doing good work, he'll just die doing the work that he does. So anyone that's saying maybe it's just an attempt to get out of jail, plea insanity, I don't really see this being true, just because of the fact, like I said, he doesn't really seem to want to get out of jail. I mean, in fact, he's even happy when he goes to jail because he's now closer to the criminals to keep them in check. So now, we will go to our recommended treatment plan. Now, the recommended treatment plan for dissociative identity disorder is there's not really a lot out there just because it's still a very controversial thing. But we did our best to basically kind of come to a conclusion as the things and steps that we have to do to kind of enlighten Walter in order to help him. So, Walter, first of all, is aware of the trauma that he endured as a child. So, there's really no need to kind of waste time trying to unearth, these unconscious memories in order to find the root. In fact, he's very much he knows exactly the trauma that he faced. Now, one of the problems he maybe doesn't understand is that the trauma that he believes Walter Kovac faced is actually still part of himself, Rorschach. So this kind of leads us to our next point: is how do we merge these two consciousnesses, or like these two selves? The first thing to understand is that Walter is highly opposed to speaking to a clinician. Throughout the entire interview process with a psychoanalyst in the comic book, he basically jeers and taunts the psychoanalyst, basically telling him, you don't really care to help me. All you want to do is just get fame because he's such a, interesting case. And so, he does have his points, but it kind of leads us into a problem because basically if he doesn't want the help of the psychoanalyst or the psychologist, whoever it is that's trying to help him, he's not going to really take much of the stuff that we say to heart. And obviously he would not be able to succumb to the effects of hypnotherapy just simply because of the fact he's not an individual that would allow him to try to receive this help. So the best approach, we believe, is just to utilize some kind of cognitive behavioral technique in order to change his behavior and his cognitive thinking. And so what we believe is best is just to basically tell Walter to kind of understand that the trauma he faced may be a reason why he's kind of splitting into this Rorschach personality. Now, we don't have to say that he has to completely give up the Rorschach personality. It can still be part of his true self, just first of all, just to try to get the two to kind of merge. And so it would be ideal for him to kind of understand that through this change of thought, maybe he can also change his behavior and not really act as such a violent criminal, and even maybe learn to accept the trauma that he faced as a child, and basically become a better member of society. Now, as I said before, Rorschach is an extremely violent individual, so I would think it would take probably a couple years before you even start seeing progress with him, just because he's so ingrained, his ideas are so deeply entrenched within him that I seriously doubt that he would change so easily. But I definitely think that through the cognitive behavioral technique, it would definitely be the best method to helping Rorschach, just simply because it's the idea of changing his thought processes. And after he changes his thought processes, the behavior will obviously follow. And so lastly, we want to look at the accuracy of the dissociative identity disorder in Watchmen. I was actually very pleased by the accuracy of this, and I'll kind of just go through all the accuracy points. In the book, or throughout the DSM-5, basically just states that people with dissociative identity disorders will sometimes resort to violence on themselves or even other people. And in Rorschach's case, it's often towards criminals. Now, if you also want to say that putting himself in a risky situation is violence towards himself, then you can also view it as such. Another accuracy was that Walter has trouble, functioning with just social factors of his life, because of the split identity. So because of that kind of split, he kind of lost some abilities to talk like a normal person, interact with the other superheroes, and so he's kind of an odd person. Walter experiences trauma as a child, so many of the people who actually have dissociative identity disorder, there's kind of a consensus that trauma in the childhood kind of makes the person split personalities because they're unable to kind of deal with this stuff. And then finally, Walter definitely does have two distinct personalities. Now, although the actual Walter Kovac personality isn't really shown that much in the book, we stated that he kind of walks around in like a bum outfit carrying the end is near sign. We can't really see like the personality of that person, but we can definitely tell that throughout the interview process, he doesn't believe himself to be Walter Kovacs. So there definitely is two distinct personalities there, different ideas and different functionings. Because when he's Walter Kovacs, like when he's dressed as a bum, he never goes and attacks people. He kind of just is like I said, a functioning member of society, whether or not he's actually doing anything. And then obviously as his vigilante persona, Rorschach, he will go and attack people. Now, this also leads us to an inaccuracy, is that in the diagnostic, in the DSM-5, basically states that one of the criteria, is actually the B diagnostic criteria, is that people with dissociative identity disorder will often kind of have gaps in their memory, and they won't be able to recall what exactly was happening. So you can sometimes find yourself, if you had this disorder, kind of just in a daze, and then just wondering, where was I? You know, how did I get here? Because you were just in this different personality, and then suddenly you are now taken over by a different personality. And so Walter doesn't really seem to have gaps in his memory. In fact, I think he would be a rather bad superhero if he didn't have good memory, because simply he has to transition so well from point to point. So he definitely knows that Walter was part of him and the things that Walter was doing before he turns into Rorschach. So I think this is a very interesting point, just to kind of see an inaccuracy. He doesn't really have gaps in the memory. But overall, I would say the depiction of the dissociative identity disorder of Walter Kovac is about 80% accurate. And we kind of basically came to this number just simply because there's 5 criteria in the diagnostic, or 5 diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. And we basically said that if he met 4 of those diagnostic criteria and only one of them is missing, we would say this is a pretty accurate portrayal of this disorder. Now finally, you can just look at our sources here. I added little annotations if you want to go back through and look at our project. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed.